The pre-approval came through and you stared at the number. It was larger than you expected. Not by a little, by enough that something shifted in how you were looking at the search. You'd been filtering listings under a certain price point, and the approval said you could go higher. And for a moment, the higher felt like an invitation rather than a ceiling. Like the market had just expanded in your direction. And then you noticed that it didn't quite feel like relief. It felt like a question. Hello, I'm Lincoln. And most people don't realize this when they're buying. But affordability isn't a number. It's a lifestyle you agree to live. And the gap between what the bank approves and what your life can actually sustain is where most of the real cost of homeownership quietly lives. The pre-approval does something specific to how you think. Before it arrives, you've been making estimates, reasonable, careful, based on what you understand about your income and your expenses and what a responsible purchase looks like for someone in your position. You've been conservative. You've been thoughtful. And then the letter arrives, and the number is bigger than your conservative estimate. And the conservatism you brought to the process starts to feel like it might have been unnecessary. The bank, which does this every day, which has access to your financial history, which runs actual risk models, has said you can afford more. If the bank says yes, it must be safe. That logic is understandable. And it is also the most expensive misunderstanding in the homeownership conversation. Because the bank isn't measuring what you can live comfortably. The bank is measuring what it can recover if you don't. Those are different calculations producing different numbers, and the number on the pre-approval reflects one of them. The question of whether your life, your specific, ongoing, full of unexpected expenses life, can sustain the payment without becoming smaller in ways you don't want it to become, that question doesn't appear on any approval document. What did you assume the approval was telling you? Let me draw a simple picture of what's actually happening. Imagine a line. At one end is your income. That number is real, and it's the foundation of everything. Now draw another line across it. That's the housing cost. Not just the mortgage, but all of it. The taxes, the insurance, the maintenance that the house will require, the ongoing financial commitment of owning something at this price in this market. The space between those two lines, the space that remains after the housing cost, is where your entire life has to fit. Not just the basics, everything. The car payments, the groceries, the medical expenses that arrive unplanned. The savings you're supposed to be building, the retirement contributions you'd been told to prioritize, the things that make the life feel like a life rather than a set of obligations. When the housing cost is calibrated to what's comfortable, that space is wide. Wide enough that when something unexpected happens, and something unexpected always happens, the response is a setback rather than a crisis. Wide enough that an opportunity can be considered on its own terms rather than through the filter of what the payment requires. When the housing cost is calibrated to the maximum the approval allows, the space compresses, sometimes significantly. And the compression doesn't announce itself. It settles in gradually as the first payment leaves and then the second. And the month that was supposed to feel manageable feels a little tighter than the estimate. And the year ends with the savings account at a different number than you planned, and you tell yourself, next year will be different. And next year usually isn't. The compression is invisible while it's happening because each individual month looks like a version of managing. You're managing. That's what it feels like from the inside. Active, deliberate, responsible management of a life that has real commitments now. What's harder to see is that the management is the compression. That the ongoing effort of making the numbers work every month is what life inside a stretched purchase actually feels like, sustained for years. In a way that gradually redefines what you expect from the month and what you're willing to reach for inside it. Here's what the compression feels like once it's installed. You're at dinner with friends and someone suggests a trip. Before, you'd have run a rough calculation and made a decision. Now the calculation is different. There's a column in it that wasn't there before. The column for the payment and everything attached to the payment, and what the month looks like around it. You say you'll think about it. You're already thinking about it. The answer is probably no, but no requires explanation. And the explanation requires admitting that the house is shaping this decision in a way you'd rather not name. You get a subscription renewal notice for something you use but don't need urgently. You cancel it. Not because it's expensive, because the aggregate of small expenses now feels different. Each one is negotiated against the housing cost, against the baseline the house established, against the life you've committed to sustaining. You don't say this out loud. You call it being responsible. You call it having priorities now that you own something. Both of those things are true, but something else is also true, something you don't name, that the house has quietly raised the floor of what your life costs. And you're now managing everything else against that higher floor without quite acknowledging what the management involves. The particular quality of it is that nothing is dramatically wrong. Nobody would look at your life from the outside and identify a crisis. The house is good. The neighborhood is good. The life you're living is, by visible measures, what you were working toward. The cost is interior. It's in the constant low-level calculation, the mental arithmetic that runs before spending decisions, before career conversations, before you allow yourself to seriously consider anything that would require the payment to wait. The calculation is always running. You stop noticing it, but it shapes almost everything. You didn't just buy the house. You bought the pressure that comes with it. Here's a story. Her name is Jennifer. She bought at 35, a careful and considered purchase that used most of what the pre-approval had offered. She'd done the research. She understood the payment. By the standard measures used to evaluate these decisions, she was making a responsible choice. The first year was as expected. The payment was large but manageable. The budget was tighter than before the house. But tighter was something she'd anticipated and adjusted for. She was managing. In year 2, her company announced a reorganization. Her role was restructured in a way that made it less interesting, less aligned with where she'd been building, and less well compensated than what she'd been planning around. The right response, professionally, strategically, was to look, to evaluate the market with some patience and find something that moved her in the direction she'd been heading. She looked, but the looking had a clock attached to it. The payment, monthly, reliable, indifferent to her employment status, was the clock. She had reserves, but not reserves designed to support an 8-month search. She had weeks, not months. The first adequate role she found, she took. 2 years later, she was still in it, not miserable, but aware that she'd made a career decision under financial pressure rather than under the conditions she'd have preferred, and that the decision had a shape she wouldn't have chosen freely. The house was fine. The life around it was something she was managing rather than designing. What decisions have you made faster than you wanted to because the payment wasn't waiting? Now a different version. His name is Paul. He bought the same year as Jennifer, in the same general market. His approval number was similar to hers. He spent several weeks looking at properties at that level, genuinely looking, seriously considering, and then made a specific decision. The payment at that level left margins he wasn't comfortable with. He bought below the approval, not dramatically below. Enough. The house was good but not impressive by the standards of what he could technically afford. He was occasionally aware of the gap. When colleagues mentioned their neighborhoods, he'd note the difference. For the first year or so, the awareness was present. Then the reorganization arrived at his company too. Same industry, same wave of restructuring, different financial structure underneath it. Paul looked for 9 months. He turned down 2 roles that were adequate. He waited for something that made genuine sense, for where he wanted to go, for what the next decade could look like. He could wait because the payment he was making had left the space for waiting. The margin he'd preserved at closing was what made 9 months possible rather than 4. He found the right role. It led somewhere. The decade that followed looks from outside like a series of good professional decisions. From inside, it looks like a series of decisions that were possible because the structure he'd built gave him room to make them properly. The approval number was the same for both of them. The lives they built inside it are not. This is the part of the affordability conversation that the approval letter can't capture. Affordability isn't static. It's not a snapshot of your income against a payment. It's a dynamic condition. The experience of living inside a financial structure month after month, year after year, as circumstances change and opportunities arrive. And unexpected expenses accumulate, and the life you're building keeps requiring things you didn't fully budget for. What affording a $500,000 house actually means is this: can the structure of your financial life sustain the payment? Sustain the life around the payment, sustain the unexpected, and still leave enough room that when something significant happens, a career disruption, an opportunity that requires uncertainty, a year that goes sideways in multiple directions at once, you can respond from a position of choice rather than desperation? For some people at some income levels in some markets, yes, the payment fits inside a life that remains wide enough to move in. Wide enough that the month doesn't require constant management. Wide enough that a bad quarter at work is a setback and not a structural threat. Wide enough that your career decisions can be made based on where you're trying to go rather than what the payment needs from you right now. For others, the payment compresses the life in ways that only become visible over time. The compression isn't dramatic. It's the slowly accumulating weight of a financial floor that's a little too high, managed month by month. Decision by decision, until the decade has a shape you didn't quite choose and can't easily explain. The sum of all the conservative choices, each reasonable, each defensible, is a life that reflects the structure it was built around. And the structure was the payment. 5 years from now, you won't remember what the approval letter said. You'll remember what the structure made possible, or what it made harder. You'll remember the year the opportunity arrived, and whether you could hold it long enough to evaluate it honestly. You'll remember what your job felt like when the payment was in the background of every conversation about your career. You'll remember whether the house was something you lived inside comfortably or something you managed around constantly. Those are the things that don't appear in any calculation, and they're the things that determine whether the purchase was what you thought it was. Here is the identity layer that sits underneath the financial one. Most people, when they're buying at a certain price point, are buying something beyond the square footage and the neighborhood and the investment potential. They're buying a version of themselves that has reached the level this house represents. And that purchase, the identity purchase, has its own cost that's separate from the mortgage. The cost is this: sustaining the identity requires sustaining the house. And sustaining the house, when the payment is at the edge of what's comfortable, requires sustaining a specific income level, a specific professional stability, a specific set of choices that keep the life around the house functioning at the level the house requires. The identity locks you in, not obviously, in the way that all the best-feeling decisions eventually do, by making it expensive to change course. You bought the house to express who you are. The house then begins to shape who you have to be. The question isn't whether you can technically afford a $500,000 house. The approval answers that. The approval has already told you what the bank thinks about your ability to make the payment. That's a real piece of information, and it matters, but it's one piece of information about one part of the question. The rest of the question, the part that determines what the decade inside the house actually looks like, is yours to answer. With information the approval document doesn't contain, and the bank isn't asking you to provide. The question is what your life looks like after you do, not immediately. The first few months will be what you expected, but 2 years in, 5 years in, at the moment when the structure you built at closing is being tested by something you didn't anticipate, does the structure leave room to absorb what goes wrong, room to say yes to what arrives unexpectedly? Room to make career decisions based on what you actually want rather than what the payment needs. Room to negotiate from patience rather than urgency. Room to be a person whose life is shaped by choice rather than managed around a fixed point. That room, or its absence, is the real cost of the house. And it was decided quietly on the day you chose which number to buy at. Not by the bank, by you. in the gap between what was approved and what you actually closed on, or whether there was a gap at all.